Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully everybody can hear me. The sound is okay. If not, let me know via the chat box here. My name is Lindsay Drake. I work at Lehigh in Alumni Relations. And today we have with us Monica Miller, who is, I'm gonna look at my slide here so I get it right, the Associate Professor of Religion, Africana Studies, and you're also the Director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Lehigh.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
So for those of you that haven't,
Looking forward to the conversation to talk about a topic that is just as concrete as it is oftentimes abstract and I think a little bit elusive. So there are different modes of thinking around cultural competency or competence or cultural translation, and three aspects that I think often come up when we think of cultural competence primarily rely on, I think, sort of aspirational kinds of qualities such as understanding or relating. How do we relate? How do we respond, right, to a particular kind of practice or a pattern of thinking or a cultural kind of life world? And this is situated around really cultural variability. And that's wide-ranging. And it's interesting, though, to think about how we often sort of narrow those aspects, right? So, for example, race and ethnicity become a really big part of how we talk about and how we think about cultural competence. But it includes age and it includes disability, of course, race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, sexuality. So it's all of those things. But this sort of approach, I think, to cultural competence, when we think of cultural range and variability, is sort of isolated in a lot of ways within a kind of common good framework or cosmology of common good that really relies on, I think, morality as well as ethics. So what is the significance of that variability? Why should we all want to be together in the same space, know how to work alongside of each other, know how to kind of create and sort of help manage the work it is or the projects that we have before us? And I tend to think that this approach to cultural competence often, Lindsay, lacks a certain kind of buy-in. Right? So I often feel at a loss for sort of translating to my students or to my colleagues, to researchers in the field, why is this important? So the why this important tends to sort of, I think, get lost or is sort of missed in that way of thinking. We also see cultural competence being used, I think, a whole lot these days, especially on institutional levels, right? This often, I think, gets narrowly kind of translated into a kind of cost-benefit arrangement that's kind of isolated in a lot of ways to an ecology of business. So think of diversity, think of inclusion, right? Think of equity. And unfortunately, we tend to kind of turn back towards those ideals or those values or those kinds of missions and the aims and the goals that an institution might have for itself when the rubber hits the road, right? Like when we're talking about litigiousness or when we're talking about a certain kind of risk. And so equity is a really good example of how a word that is, I think, most often used and kind of emerging from economics, right? Or the kind of, business world. When we think about shares, how we translate shares, of a company, what's the value of shares, right? And so that then becomes translated into something like equity when we think of fairness or we think of historical and cultural kinds of asymmetries that we tend to kind of balance out and manage through this idea of equity. And that approach, in a lot of ways, it works. And I think it's really important. It's really aspirational. I think it speaks to a certain kind of historical circumstance around a lot of categories of identity and social difference and culture. But for me, it doesn't really do the trick, right? And I find myself, again, kind of searching for how do I explain to students or how do I translate in my scholarship the why this is important. So there's a third way, and I like to think of this as a kind of social theoretical way of thinking about, return on identity as investment, ROI. So ROI is something that we all can see, ourselves as having a sort of buy-in with and to and kind of around. So what if we were to think about investment, as identity, right? So that we're not just kind of consuming identity or the kind of cost benefit of identity, but we're actually producers of this thing that we're kind of buying into, and we're thinking about the risks and the management of that. And this is where I kind of go to one track in my research, my program of research, which involves, cultural difference in and around pop culture, hip hop in particular. And I think of Jay-Z where he says, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, right? So like he's pointing to his own self as a business. And I think that latter kind of approach really emphasizes the kind of profit of identity, the risks of it, the investments, of it, but it also does a certain kind of work of demythologizing. There's no, sorry, Adam Smith, there's no invisible, hand here. We get to kind of demystify, what it is we're talking about when we think of economy, when we think of business, when we think of cultural competence. What does it mean to kind of translate? And I think one risk to thinking about it in this kind of way is we can sort of over-reduce, right? We can think about it in ways that economizes out, the larger so what kind of question. If we're buying and trading and we're kind of liquidating and, we're doing a work of equitability in and around identities, then do we lose a certain kind of moral? Do we lose a certain kind of ethic? When we think of culture and identity as the investment itself, that is the capital. That's what we're talking about. So, for today's purposes, what's the bottom line? That, despite a certain kind of rhetorical housing or whatever kind of name we give cultural competence and the why and the what it often makes up, the reality is that exchange values and markets and aspects of profit and loss, undergirding all of that is identity itself. That is cultural competence, right? Like it's always there. It's never not there. It's not lost. And so underneath all of those things, then we get to interest, not only interest in a business sense, right? But like what kinds of human interests, what kinds of social and cultural interests give rise to this thing that we call culture, and how is culture, completely inseparable from this thing that we call competence of the market, competence of life, competence, of just our daily business of, moving in and out of different kinds of spaces. So there really is no invisible hand there, that we are the market, our identities, our cultures are the market. And we have to be, we have to sort of get up to speed with that work of translating, right? With that work of competence. So, what does representation without translation look like? And I have a whole lot more to say. I don't want to take up too much time with that, but if we think of aims and missions and goals that a business might have, that a certain kind of program of research might have, that an institution, a corporation, might have, what is the know-how of going about that work of competence, that work of translation? On one hand, we can kind of keep it sort of limited to or reduced by, the rhetorical kind of aspirational kind of marketing that we all do and play into ourselves, right? Global, internationalization, right? Diversity, like those things all rely on particular cultural markers of difference, right? But we failed to discuss and really talk specifically about the return on those investments as identities itself.
So that being said, talking about identity is where you come at this in terms of speaking about this to your students and,
right.
and what you're looking at it in terms of your research and things like that. How do you get your students to understand that, and how can our audience kind of understand a little bit more about what that identity is, and if we're not understanding it, how can we learn more about that? Is it learning about different cultures on our own, or is it bigger than that?
It's a great question. So I come at the mode or the thinking, the intellectual kinds of streams of thought and the social reality around cultural competence from a standpoint of identity and difference. I would throw back probably to my students, like, what is culture without identities, right? You need identities to make that stuff that we call culture. And when we over differentiate culture, right, or if we make culture about something that's always over there or in this part of the world, right, or kind of living among a certain specialized, religious form or ideal or kind of ritual, what we end up doing is disassociating this thing that we all share amongst each other and with one another from our own selves. Right. So my first task always in the classroom in particular is to really get students to think about their own culture. What identities, right? What categories of difference and identity do you bring to the table? How do you market yourself, right, when you're sort of interviewing for a job? Or how do you think your degree is going to market a particular kind of identity for you? And what kind of culture surrounds that kind of identity? And do you see that as disconnected from or relating to who you think you are as a person? So it's very easy to kind of get, sort of caught up in this differentiated kind of approach when it comes to culture and difference and competence, where we're focused on the big other. We have to get competent about someone else that we're not familiar with, right? Or cultural life reality or philosophy or a way of doing things or a racial ethnic kind of, differentiation that we ourselves don't see. But everybody has a race ethnicity, right? Or race ethnicity is kind of mapped onto all bodies. So my first task in the classroom is really to get students to kind of begin reading themselves first, right? If we think about it in terms of a corporation or an institution, that institution has to build its own identity before they can go about that work of marketing that identity or a certain kind of cultural awareness or reality to other kinds of spheres. And so that usually gets folk talking, I think, on a more equitable kind of ground. And now we're having a conversation about what cultures are right here in this space and how can we then think about how those things connect or not, disconnect from cultures that we see as far away from ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop here just a second and let everybody know now's the time to start asking your questions to Monica. You can do that via the chat box here. So go ahead and just start typing away, and we'll come back to those. I have another question for you as people are typing in.
Yeah.
You mentioned the kind of three areas earlier. I think a lot of us probably fall into the areas of knowing in this kind of business and equity space. So I think getting to the third part is probably a little more philosophical for a lot of us. If we go back to kind of the business equity area, if we're talking about cultural competency as, helping your bottom line and
right.
a return on investment, why do you say that? Why is that? How can having a better understanding of culture help your business?
Yeah, so I think that that's an important question, and I think that for me, when it comes to the bottom line, we have to identify the investment of you, right? What is my investment? Like, who am I? So when you can begin to think of your own cultural competence, right, before we can understand others, what is the investment of your own, right? So it's like taking yourself perhaps much more seriously than you might have thought about yourself in the past. What is the investment of you in all of that cultural variability and all the, the promise and the peril, the beauty, right? The asymmetries, the kinds of equitabilities, we have to ask that kind of question in order then to get to what sort of return can you yield, right? And then how can you maximize that yield through cultural competence of other folk, right? Or other groups or other, spaces and geographies and other kinds of institutional missions that we had not yet considered. So then you begin to come at it, I think, a bit more affirmatively rather than from a kind of deficit, risk loss kind of, profit loss gain sort of approach. And I think it's really empowering to do that, right? Like on one hand, we sort of risk, again, kind of reducing or over-economizing or kind of, having an overconfidence, a certain kind of hubris about How do I take this thing that's historically asymmetrical about my race or ethnicity, think about that in terms of capital, right? And think about my identity as a particular kind of investment into making the world a better place, making the workplace more diverse, making classrooms, right, much more robust in terms of cultural realities and awareness and, thinking and practices and rituals and all of those sorts of things. I think of hip hop when you ask me that question. I think of the early days of hip hop, one of my areas of research focus, and this, organic emergent life form kind of, is born right in the ghettos on the underside of post-industrialism in South Bronx in 1973 South Bronx. And, you look 10 years later and hip hop begins to think about itself, its cultural variability, its kind of identity, thinking about that investment. What is the return for hip hop, right? The return is that, you've got the company, Champagne, Cristal, coming to someone like a Jay-Z saying, hey, what you're doing is really bad for our brand. Can you distance yourself from it, right? And Jay-Z says, no, but let me think about how I might sort of reinvent, that product. What can we do with this sort of, product? I think of someone like 2 Chainz, right, where he's, got this show, excuse my language, the most expensivest shit, where he's sitting with unlikely business partners. He's having conversations with folks that you would never think he is. And they're doing a certain kind of, cultural kind of building awareness, right? And he also has his own process of cultural competence, at work at the same time. And he's sharing a meal with, famous people, that you would never imagine that he'd be sitting at a table with. And they're not necessarily asking each other questions about the other, right? So the competence is not built in, tell me more about you. Do I feel comfortable sitting at a table with you? It's, let's share this like $5,000 meal and now have a conversation about what we think we taste, what we think we see, what kind of ingredients. Is this worth it? Is it not worth it? Who's going to buy this, kind of food? So I just think there are really kind of unique and innovative ways to get at that work of cultural competence. But I think it begins with the self. What investment can you see, as, a possibility for the identities that you bring to the table? And I think that's empowering as much as it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few questions that have come in via chat. Rich is asking, has anyone done research on how to meld different aged members of the workforce to optimize business results? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure about that, but I can see, a lot of ways in which forging a certain kind of intergenerational workforce, right? That, when you bring young people, together, with middle-aged folk or with older folk, you're talking, again, not to sound too philosophical, but you're talking about a different range of wisdom, right? But a quote I often think about, it's actually one that really defines our Department of Religion Studies here, which I'm a faculty member in, which is the past is always present, right? That we have to be anthropologists just as much as we have to be historians, right? And so I tend to think of intergenerational spaces in that way where, my grandmother is not going to be able to understand the kind of language I use. She's certainly not going to have much to offer by way of hip hop, but she's got a certain kind of, long sort of cultural memory, right? Or what we would call on the institutional end, an institutional memory about the way things used to be. How certain things have not really changed, what sorts of things have changed so much that folk in her age group kind of feel left out of the business of doing business, or, thinking about a certain demographic when we're creating products and thinking about their usability and utility.
It's interesting you mentioned anthropologists. The next question from Oliver is, so should companies hire anthropologists? You'd probably be a proponent.
Yes, and hire students that major in religion studies, right? I think yes to both of those things, because culture really, so I think of religion studies, which is just inherently from its birth, interdisciplinary, as is Africana studies, as is women gender sexuality studies, and anthropology, absolutely. And if we look at what the field of anthropology has had to go through, I think historically, they had a particular approach that's problematic, right? Like, no, my job ought not be going around the world kind of cataloging what primitivism looks like, right? Or what a noble savage kind of looks like. But if we look at where anthropology has started and all of the ethnocentrism and, the sexism and the racism and the things that we know, are problematic today, we look at what anthropology has been able to yield, right? It's given us a way to think about that variability, to understand how people live their lives and their local kinds of ecologies in ways that don't necessarily make them over unique, but we can kind of begin to relate, right? We go back to that first model of relating, that there's some cross-cultural things that we share, and there's some things that would be really good to kind of, learn more about. So it's, again, going back to the I, going back to the self. How can I make myself, a better person, or how can I maximize my own potential, my own utility by learning from others, right? It's not just for a common good, it's so that I can be my better self.
Great. Cheryl from the class of 91, hi Cheryl. She has a very interesting question. So what is the line between cultural competency, so building a profile of the identity of a person or group, and stereotyping? I want to avoid my perception of identity being reductionist. How can one do that effectively?
Cheryl, that's the money question right there. I don't know if there's a way for that's tricky, right? We don't want to reify stereotypes, but I don't think there's a way to kind of get away from them. And so when I think about the reification of stereotypes, which absolutely does reduce, let's pick a demographic I'm familiar with, Black women. It reduces Black women to their hair, right? For example, hair is really significant for women of color among a variety of, racial, ethnic, cultural groups. That is true. And when you begin to, sort of involve yourself and kind of put forth an effort to be in relationship with more women of color, to learn more about yourself and what you have in common or what you don't have in common, this thing that was just a stereotype, which happens at a distance from a group, right? So that stereotypes are not necessarily, born ex nihilo or kind of out of nothing, but we tend to get it wrong because we don't have an interactive kind of engaged relationship or an experience with a group of difference, right? That we tend to then, sort of make friendships with or, become colleagues with those that we feel act the same or those that we feel are similar to our own subjectivities and positionalities. And so I don't think stereotypes, we ever get away from them, but we learn something new and something different and something, I think, much more variable about that kind of group for whom the stereotype is attempting to either project in a really kind of caricatured kind of way. We begin to learn more about that group. So then we can say, yeah, hair is really significant for Black women, but not in the ways in which I had initially thought, right? This more universalizable or generalizable stereotype that is often concocted and manufactured when we try to have community by ourselves. We have to stay in community, right, for those sorts of things. Right. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. So our homework for today is to go home and figure out what our identity is,
right,
where we identify kind of culturally, and
right,
then figure out where to take that from here.
Yeah, I think that's right, Lindsay. It's so hard for students to do, for not just students, for faculty and for bosses, right? Like, again, we love those aspirational, kinds of missions and aims, diversity and global and, things being, kind of international. And then we can think of international as being over there somewhere. The global is always over there and it's never here. How does the global travel through our own daily practice? How are we thinking with a larger world in ways that we don't even necessarily see ourselves being in conversation with or impacted by. So I just think there's so much value in taking that first step and kind of cataloging what is your culture, not the one that you were told you were born into, but the one that you have made for yourself. And again, that's why I just love that example of hip hop. It is a transnational cultural force that has taken the world by storm, and it looks 50 million different kinds of ways. And that variability does not threaten the homogeneity of what we call hip hop. That, as you know, difference kind of reproduces difference in hip hop. Hip hop still gets to be hip hop and gets to sort of be this big tent that is representative of a kind of cultural competence that adequately reflects the consumers and producers of that life world.
Mm-hmm. We've got one more question, two more coming in. We'll see what we have time for, because we're getting towards the end. But Karen Mitten, hi Karen, is asking, do you, Monica, conduct workshops on cultural competency? You're in one now. Or know of anyone who might, for organizations that need to grow in this area?
Wow, such another really important question. I know there are a lot of corporations and organizations and, you know, individual entrepreneurs, if I can call them that do this kind of work. I myself don't necessarily do workshops, although when I'm going about my work of giving public lectures, I do that, you know, I do those things in civic spaces, I do those, you know, sorts of talks within academic institutions. So I'm always trying to really diversify the sorts of spaces, churches, mosques, synagogues, right? Street corners, right? Having a certain kind of level of conversation. But I think it's absolutely necessary for corporations and for businesses, you know, to make a cultural competency kind of space possible. I'd love to come visit your business if you're interested. And if you're here at Lehigh, you know, feel free to stop in, you know, and stop by a religion course or Africana studies, women, gender, sexuality studies. You know, for me, this topic really comes out of a pilot course that I did here at Lehigh in spring of 2016, which was God in the Almighty Market, Religion, Capital, and ROI.
Great, thank you. Karen, get in touch. And then Rich is asking, do you watch the TV program Blackish? If so, what's your opinion?
Oh, I'm going to hold my opinion. But there's a whole lot that I love about Blackish. I think it's brilliant and really genius in a lot of ways. And, you know, if I could end on this note, Lindsay, what I would say, you know, I'm thinking of Blackish now, and I'm thinking of stereotypes, you know, cultural competence is, you know, or competency, that work of getting after that is difficult work. It's complicated work. And I think humor and comedy are absolutely necessary to be at the table when we're doing this, because the reality is that the more we involve ourselves in cultures and in groups and in social realities, not our own, the more we're going to mess up. But the beauty is that we get to do that in community with one another, and we get a sort of checks and balances system that I think is never ending. And once that work ends, then we end that work of cultural competence.
Thank you. It is 12:30, so our time is up.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Rich, I'm going to look for somebody that can speak about age and business for you, see if we can get a new webinar up on that. When we end here, I'm going to send a link to a survey. It'll pop up. If it doesn't pop up for any reason, I'll also send you guys an email just so you can tell us what you thought of the talk today. We love to hear from you. And thanks for joining us. We hope you'll join us again soon. Thanks to Monica for being with us.
Take care, everyone.